Suzanne Jane Capper was born on the 1st of September 1976 in Manchester, England. Described as a gentle and easily influenced girl, Suzanne had spent time in care whilst growing up, before she and her older sister Michelle eventually went to stay with their stepfather. As Suzanne entered into her teen years, she'd attended Moston Brook High School, but had begun to truant, and by 1992, at the age of 16, her attendance was described as erratic. The time in which Suzanne should have been at school, she was at the home of Jean Powell, a woman who had babysat Suzanne since she was 6 years old. Jean was 10 years older than Suzanne, a 26-year-old living with 3 children in a dilapidated home at 97 Langworthy Road in Moston, a small Victorian terraced house where she also dealt drugs and was involved with the handling of stolen motor vehicles. Often babysitting Jean's young children for free, Suzanne would also spend the night at Jean's home and then skip school the next morning. Suzanne had been a quiet girl who had struggled to make friends, hence why she did not like the school environment. She clung desperately to her friendship with Jean. Unfortunately, Jean would notice Suzanne's desperation for friends and would use this to her advantage. Suzanne's family would later discover that Jean had taken Suzanne out of school and was making her work as a cleaner at the CIS building in town, a set of high-rise offices. Jean was taking Suzanne's wages and letting her keep just £5 per week. When Suzanne's family found out about this, they confronted Jean, but she responded by threatening to burn their house down. The real trouble began, however, when a neighbour named Bernadette McNeely had moved in. 24-year-old Bernadette McNeely had 3 children of her own and had been living only a few doors down from Jean Powell, but by 1992, she had moved into Jean's house along with her children. This already ramshackle house had now become a den of drugs, parties and sex. Suzanne continued to stay regularly, even though Jean and Bernadette frequently bullied her. Suzanne's sister Michelle later said, "It was not that she was scared of them, it's just that she would do anything for them. She pampered to their every whim." Soon enough, a 16-year-old named Anthony Dodson, who was also a regular to the home, entered a sexual relationship with Jean Powell and Bernadette McNeely, as well as Suzanne Capper. Jean was separated from her 29-year-old husband Glyn, although the two remained friendly and he would regularly visit from his nearby home. Jean was also sexually involved with Jeffrey Lee, another regular visitor to the house, and a purchaser of amphetamines. Jean's younger brother, Clifford Pook, would also be at the home often. In late November of 1992, at one of their drug-fueled parties, Suzanne and Jean met a friend of a friend named Mohammed Yusuf. Suzanne encouraged Jean to sleep with Yusuf in exchange for money, a suggestion that Jean didn't care for. She later told police that she gave Suzanne, quote, "a good hiding for trying to make her go with an Arab." Suzanne allegedly told neighbours that Jean had tied her up and held her for 4 days, but none of them believed her. In another instance, Bernadette, Anthony, Jean and Glyn had all contracted pubic lice. Bernadette had blamed Suzanne. Enraged by this baseless claim, the group forced the girl to shave her pubic hair in front of them as a ritual humiliation and clean it up off of the floor. Bernadette had also convinced herself that Suzanne had stolen a pink duffel coat from her, worth around £60. On the 7th of December 1992, Jean Powell and Bernadette McNeely invited Suzanne to a party. A boy she liked was going to be there, they told her. There was no boy, however, and there was no party. Suzanne arrived to Jean's home, where Glyn Powell and Anthony Dodson were laying in wait for her. She was grabbed as soon as she arrived and held down, while Glyn Powell shaved her head and her eyebrows before making her clean it up. Then, he placed a plastic bag over her head and walked around whilst hitting her. She was then kicked by Jean and Bernadette as she lay curled up on the floor, and both women took turns beating her with a 3-foot-long wooden instrument and a belt. Afterwards, Jean Powell locked her in a cupboard overnight. The following morning, Suzanne was taken upstairs and locked in another cupboard. On the 8th of December, she was transferred to Bernadette's house because of concern that Jean and Bernadette's 6 children were disturbed by Suzanne's crying. There, she was tied with her legs spread apart to an upturned bed in a downstairs back room. They tied her to the bed frame with cord, rope, electric flex, belts, and a chain. During this time, Bernadette injected so many amphetamines into herself that she began to call herself Chucky, after the character from Child's Play. During visits to the house, Clifford Pook and Jeffrey Lee also partook in Suzanne's torture, which also included burning her with cigarettes. After days of lying in her own urine and feces, Suzanne's mouth was stuffed with socks so she couldn't scream, as she was placed into a bath of concentrated disinfectants that burned her skin. She was scrubbed with a stiff brush with sufficient force to remove her skin. At one point, Bernadette injected Suzanne with amphetamines, placed headphones over her ears, and blasted rave music at full volume, which featured Chucky's catchphrase looping on repeat, "I'm Chucky, wanna play?" After being held captive for 5 days, the teenagers' torturers soon came up with a murderous plan. They needed to get rid of Suzanne once and for all. Clifford Pook pried out 2 of Suzanne's front teeth so that her body would be more difficult to identify. Police later found these at his house, like some kind of macabre trophy. In the early hours of the 14th of December 1992, the group loaded Suzanne into the trunk of a Fiat Panda car that Jeffrey Lee had stolen. They drove Suzanne 13 miles to a wooded area named Werner Flow near Stockport. 3 of them, Jeffrey Lee, Anthony Dodson, and Bernadette McNeely, then shoved her through the bramble. As Suzanne lay almost entirely naked on the ground, Bernadette doused her in gasoline. Seconds later, Glynn sparked Suzanne with a lighter, and she was in flames. As the helpless teen screamed in agony, the group drove away, leaving her for dead. As they drove home in the early hours of that morning, they sang along to Burn Baby Burn all the way home. Little did they know was that Suzanne Capper wasn't dead yet. With the last of her strength, she pulled herself up the embankment and managed to stagger for a quarter of a mile, where she was spotted by the driver of a passing vehicle who was on his way to work at around 6:10 a.m. The man wept as he tried to hold her hand, but described it as turning to ash. He commented that Suzanne's legs were like raw meat, her hands and feet were badly charred, and her face was almost featureless. But despite her suffering, he was struck by how polite Suzanne was. He took Suzanne to a nearby home where the residents called emergency services. She had constantly thanked her rescuers, but was in extreme pain. When the wife of the homeowner had tried to hug her, she had pulled away as she could not bear to be touched. She drank 6 glasses of water, but could not hold the glass by herself as her fingertips had turned black. Suzanne was rushed to a hospital and was able to tell the police who she was, what had happened, and who exactly had been responsible. Sadly, shortly after, she slipped into a coma and passed away due to her injuries 4 days later, on the 18th of December, 1992. The extent of her burns was such that her mother and stepfather were unable to recognise her, and she was positively identified by a partial fingerprint from her thumb, the only part of her hands that was not severely burned. The inquiry into Suzanne Capper's death was led by Detective Inspector Peter Wall of Greater Manchester Police. After Suzanne had given him the names and address of her killers, he instructed officers to attend 97 Langwarry Road and arrest everyone that they found there. Jean Powell and Bernadette McNeely reportedly laughed and joked with each other whilst being arrested. Initially, all 6 denied involvement, but under questioning, Anthony Dodson, who had been urged by his father to tell the truth, began to talk. Following Suzanne's death, they were all charged with her murder on the 23rd of December 1992. Suzanne's funeral took place on January the 18th, 1993 at Blackley Cemetery. The trial commenced later on in the year, on the 16th of November 1993 and lasted 22 days. All 6 denied murder, and in their testimonies, each defendant tried to minimize his or her part in the crime. In the end, Jean Powell, Glyn Powell, and Bernadette McNeely were given life sentences for Suzanne Capper's murder, though Bernadette's sentence was controversially reduced by 12 months, and she was released in 2015 after she proved to be a model prisoner, apparently filled with remorse. She has been given a new name and a makeover, and is living in a secret location in the northwest of England. Jeffrey Lee was released from prison in 1998, Clifford Pook in 2001, Anthony Dudson in 2013, Jean Powell in 2017, and most recently, Glyn Powell was released on licence in May of 2023. Suzanne was very forgiving, her mother said, but she was also a girl who would try to sort out her problems on her own. That's what she did in the end. She survived her ordeal long enough to name every single one of them.